And now we'll turn to questions from the committee, and the chair will recognize himself. And let me ask you this, Vice President Gore. We're in an economic recession right now. Our energy policies in the past have not protected us against price spikes or the impact on our economy, our national security. Could you talk a little bit about what your view is with regard to how the legislation pending before this committee could actually have a positive impact upon the workers of our country in the long run?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I believe that one part of the answer to the economic crisis is to create jobs with public investments in infrastructure. Economists across the spectrum, from liberal to moderate to conservative, all agree that these are the unusual circumstances where both sides say, yes, we need to have public investment to get the economy moving more quickly again. And all sides agree that the best short-term investments to create jobs quickly is in infrastructure. The focus on green infrastructure to lay the foundation for our 21st century economy is the logical place to make those investments. Prior to the current era, the largest surge in economic growth and productivity was the Industrial Revolution. Historians say that one among many reasons for the onset of the Industrial Revolution was the perception in England and Scotland, where it began, that they were running out of trees. And so that gave them an extra impetus to go for the coal. And the new steam engine and the other devices ran on coal. Now it is obvious that we are either at or near peak oil, especially for, people argue about this, but the affordable, light, sweet oil, of course there's more of this heavy, dirty oil that's very high price, and that's a different story altogether. But we are at or near the peak for the oil that dominates the market today. As the rate of new discoveries declines, the secular demand in places like China and India is rising. If we didn't have a global recession today, the oil price would be truly at all-time record levels. For the last 35 years, since the fall of 1973, when President Richard Nixon responded to the Arab OPEC oil embargo by saying we've got to have become energy independent, we have been on a roller coaster with the price going up, delivering body blows to our economy, and just as we summon the political will to do something about it, the price collapses again, and that political will dissipates. As President Obama put it, we've gone from shock to trance. But this roller coaster is headed toward a crash, and we're in the front car. So when you talk about energy prices, remember last summer and what happened then. And remember what's going to happen as the global economy recovers and the price skyrockets again. What are y'all going to say to your constituents about what you can do then? Well, you can say, well, we don't have any control over OPEC. We don't have any control over the world oil markets. Well, this bill makes it clear that we do have some control over OPEC. We can form a bipartisan national will to shake off the trance and keep our eyes on the ball and protect the American people from the skyrocketing prices that are in our future if we just do the same old thing and expect the same old results. So we can create jobs by putting people to work, building the unified national smart grid, building the solar panels, building the windmills, building the geothermal installations, insulating homes, changing out the heating and lighting systems. And those jobs can't be outsourced. They're here, right here. And as the work is done, it makes our country stronger and positions us to lead the world in this new energy revolution.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I'm going to turn and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask two questions. I'll ask them in somewhat rapid fire and let both of you respond, but it may take me a minute to finish the first one. All of us here want to reduce emissions, and we want to reduce emissions without losing jobs, and we want to do it in such a way that the costs will not impact our nation's capability to be competitive with other countries overseas. But we know that the most contentious issue is cap and trade, which many of the panelists the last 2 days have said, in fact, it would increase costs. Last year, Senator Warner, you knew well your bill failed to get the necessary votes to pass with cloture. Another 12 that voted for that said that they would vote no on final passage in a letter, including my two senators, Senator Debbie Stabenow and Carl Levin. This month, April, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, the Senate rejected cap and trade as part of reconciliation, which, of course, would have required only 50 votes instead of 60. You've seen the headlines. This from last week in the Washington Post, India rejects calls for emission cuts. The same has been broadcast as relates to China. And I would note that it's pretty interesting to me that some of the same folks in the Congress who were opposed to entry of the WTO of China because the conditions on China weren't tough enough now are in favor of, in fact, believing that the WTO will have the framework to provide for the tariffs on goods produced in China. But there is a legitimate fear that there's going to be serious leakage of jobs to China and India. And frankly, my state can't afford to lose any more. We've lost 150,000 jobs in Michigan this year already. If somehow cap and trade defied all the odds and got to the President's desk, legal challenges probably taking years will start, not knowing how many jobs will depart as it relates to WTO. As it impacts the planet, by the way, the steel workers have indicated that they emit only 1.4 tons of carbon for every ton of steel produced in the U.S. versus about 4 tons of carbon per ton in China. What would be wrong with the WTO taking up the cap and trade debate and requiring all member nations to, in fact, have a plank, an enforcement plank, as part of their participation in WTO so that we know in advance whether or not they would comply or not and would be in agreement? The second question that I have is, doesn't nuclear have to be part of this equation? Senator Gore, when you testified, or Vice President Gore, when you testified before this committee in the last Congress, many of us noted that there wasn't a word in your book or a scene, which would have been worth 1,000 words, right, a picture, in the movie about nuclear. EPA's own analysis said that in order to meet the targets set in this bill, there has to be a 200% increase in nuclear. The President has called for doubling or tripling renewables. Shouldn't we be doing the same thing with nuclear?
You want to go first?
I'll be very brief. On the nuclear, I'm proud to say I was part of a Navy that ran ships all over the world with those plants. We had the best safety record, still have it. Nuclear power is safe. It is relegated to the sidelines because of the cost and the lack of the industrial base and fear. We have got to do a frontal assault and explain the safety is there, that it's zero greenhouse emissions, but the cost initially is pretty heavy. And we've got to encourage the Congress to put forth the tax provisions, and the guarantees, and other legislation that need to jumpstart this industry. I couldn't agree with you more, the need to have nuclear power as a part of it. As to the WTO, we recognize that greenhouse emissions know no border. They come from all the countries. And if we in the United States and other countries begin to take up and burden our taxpayers with costs to achieve some reduction and the others go full bore in the opposite direction, they'll just cancel out our efforts. The WTO provides a forum in which we can begin to induce, particularly for China and India, to come and join. I somehow hope there's a sense of consciousness in those governments that they are duty-bound to step up this time at the fourth time international conference in Copenhagen and begin to pull on the oar with the rest of us.
Thank you, Congressman Upton. First of all, I'm glad you cited the steel workers because the steel workers have formally endorsed this. They're strongly in support of this legislation and the cap-and-trade approach generally. Secondly, you mentioned India and China. I think it's important to have that discussion. And while they're often lumped together, in my view, they're actually very different as they relate to the challenge of the climate crisis. Partway through this century, India will surpass China in population and at some point may rival China in industrial power. But the reality today and for the near-term future is very different. China is one of the two largest emitters along with us. India really is not. It is growing, but the significance of China is way larger than that of India where this crisis is concerned. And while it's true, the headline you quoted with respect to India, I gave my slideshow in the Indian Parliament. I've met with them and their leaders numerous times, and I can tell you there's a lot of movement in India. But the position you quoted at present is correct. With China, it's a little bit different. They are now actively moving. They have far larger investments in green infrastructure than the United States does, even after the stimulus bill, even after this bill is adopted. They see the future. They have by far the largest solar installations. They're moving on every single front. And there have been active discussions between Beijing and the provincial governments about internal reduction targets, a kind of regional cap, region by region, in China. And they have left the door open to a very different approach at the meeting in December compared to what they have done in the past. Just last week, the head of the International Energy Agency, in consultation with Chinese authorities, issued a report showing why it's absolutely essential for China to reduce their CO2 emissions. So I think that if the United States takes the lead, I think it's very likely we'll see a very different response from China this time. Now, on the WTO issue that you mentioned, there are provisions in this bill that accomplish substantially the result that you talk about in your question. And there are those who say a non-discriminatory approach taken by a country that has established limitations on carbon, if it's applied even-handedly, might well survive in the WTO. I wouldn't leave it up to them to come to an answer because it might be like the Doha round. It might be endless. I think we can't turn it over to the WTO. I think we've got to be in charge of our own destiny. And then if it has an international dimension where we say, okay, we've got to even this out, if some country X doesn't have any limitations, we'll find a legal way to even that out. This bill puts in place mechanisms to go down that road if it becomes necessary. So I think that's excellent. Now, finally, the nuclear discussion would take more time. I don't want to impose on the time restrictions here, but I'll give you a brief answer. I'm not anti-nuclear. I am skeptical that it will play a much larger role than it does now. And I won't go through all the reasons. Let's assume for the moment that we solve the nuclear waste storage problem. Let's assume that we solve the problem of accidents by the people who are operating these reactors. They're all one-offs. There's not a single one that's like another one, so they are a little bit vulnerable. But let's assume that we can solve that. For the 8 years I was in the White House, every single nuclear weapons proliferation problem we had to deal with was connected to a reactor program. And though the technologies are somewhat different, if you're a dictator in a country that has a reactor program and you've got a team of scientists and engineers capable of managing that and a fuel cycle, you can force them to work secretly at night to build you nuclear weapons. That's what North Korea did. That's what Iran is trying to do. That's what has happened elsewhere. So in some of these unstable regions, if we model the behavior to put these nuclear reactors everywhere in the world, we would rue that day. We'd also run out of fuel pretty quickly and have to go to these other cycles that enrich the fuel even more, which would make the weapons problem much, much worse. But the final issue is cost. There is not a single engineering or construction firm anywhere in this country who can give you an accurate cost projection for what it takes to build a nuclear reactor. Not a single one. And the utilities are scared of those overruns. And there's another issue. But along with the expense, they only come in one size, extra large. Because the economies of scale for the foreseeable decades ahead mandate a very large size. I know that there are research projects on smaller reactors. They are at least 15, 20 years away. I hope they get one. But here's the problem that the current generation of reactors poses. The utility managers face an uncertain future on demand projection. You had a witness earlier this week who pointed out what the projections for energy use in the 1970s were and how high they went and what the actual results were. I remember in the Tennessee Valley, TVA, in response to demand projections showing an annualized compounded 7% increase in electricity demand, started 20-some-odd reactors, and then after that embargo that I mentioned earlier, oil prices shot up, coal prices ought not be tied to oil, but they are because of the substitution, and then electricity prices went up. That 7% figure went down to 1%, and most of those reactors had to be canceled. And that's the real reason why there weren't any orders after 1973. It's the expense and the lack of flexibility. If you're looking 15 years out in a time which, like the 1970s, once again has a lot of uncertainty about what the future demand's going to be and what the future price is going to be, you want more flexibility, smaller increments. That's why for each of the last 2 years, the largest new increments for electricity generation in the United States were wind, because they're going for these smaller increments that give them more flexibility. So, again, I'm not opposed to nuclear. I think it ought to compete in the marketplace. I do think that for all of those reasons, it's likely to play only a small increased role from what it does now.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Henry Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice President Gore and Senator Warner, thank you for your testimony and for your leadership on the energy and global warming issues. 2 days ago, we had testimony from a group called the United States Climate Action Partnership. It's a coalition of industry and environmental leaders. And their testimony was remarkable because instead of corporate CEOs and environmental leaders opposing each other, which is what usually happens when we deal with environmental bills, they were united in calling for strong, effective energy and climate legislation. And your testimony today is remarkable in a similar way. You come from opposing political parties, yet you are united in calling for enactment of market-based controls on carbon emissions. To succeed, we're going to have to bridge differences between environmentalists and industry, Democrats and Republicans. And your testimony shows that we can do that. In my conversation with my colleagues, I often hear from members who tell me they want to do something, but they're worried about their districts and what will happen in the transition to a clean energy economy. They're concerned about meeting the costs of the transition. How would each of you answer members of Congress who raise those concerns? They're legitimate concerns. What would you tell them, Mr. Gore and Mr. Warner?
Well, I'd give a short answer. I was privileged to be in the Senate when we did the Clean Air Act, second round of Clean Air Act. Mm-hmm. And I watched that unfold. I was privileged to work with George Mitchell, Pat Moynihan, John Chafee. They were the three triumvirate, they were sort of the four horsemen. And it was strong leadership from the top down in the Senate. When the bill came to the floor out of the committee, we recognized that it was bogged down. George Mitchell then undertook around the clock to see members individually, singularly, and so forth, to try and work through their constituencies, which oftentimes is different, as we well know, in different portions of America. But it was that strong leadership that got it done. And you ought to go back and research some of the rhetoric and the press at that time. They thought the sky was going to fall in if that Clean Air Act were passed. Well, what's the result? Energy and the clean air did survive. The industrial base formulated a means to do it and are doing it far below the original cost projections. So I just say we have to muster the courage and point to those chapters in history when the Congress has led forcefully and achieved it. And this time, I think, fortunately, a president is going to be a strong ally.
I think that the cost of energy will come down when we make this transition to renewable energy. Look at electric cars, for example. The internal combustion engine, for most of the time it's been used, has had an efficiency of about 15%. An electric motor has an efficiency of about 90%. You can run an electric car on the equivalent of $1 a gallon gasoline. How do we get from here to there? We have to make the investments and make the adjustments in the energy marketplace to accomplish this transition. We have two paths we can pick. One is to keep on being hostage to OPEC, even as we know this marketplace is leading to sky-high prices as the oil reserves begin to deplete and as the demand rises. Or we can decide we're going to control our own destiny and put in place this infrastructure that will allow us to give the American people lower energy prices. Now, what's the cost of the transition? The latest and what I regard as the most authoritative estimate of the cost of the transition is about 30 cents per day. As you said, Mr. Chairman, the cost of a postage stamp. And that doesn't even take into account the savings that the same household paying that 30 cents a day can make if they take advantage of the other provisions that will allow them to insulate and change out the windows and lighting and have sharp decreases in their energy consumption.
Well, I think you're making a very valid point. We do have regional differences. We represent different parts of the country and different constituencies. But we have a national interest to figure out how to get this done and to recognize that we have to reconcile these concerns that are very legitimate. I think the two of you illustrate that, as we heard from the U.S. CAP the other day. We've got to keep working at it. I remember that Clean Air Act reauthorization. We worked hard on this committee, and under the leadership of Chairman Dingell, we got a bill out 41-1 out of committee. And the first cap and trade program was in that legislation to deal with the acid rain problem. Industry told us it would cost billions of dollars, and instead it was a tenth of what they predicted. So I think we need to push things forward, do it in a responsible way, try to bring everybody along with us, because we all have a national concern, international concern, as we address our regional ones as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to point out, since we keep talking about the Clean Air Act, amendments of 1990, that I was on the committee, and I was one of those Republicans who voted with Chairman Dingell. In fact, I was a co-sponsor of the bill, and I know most people think I've gone over to the dark side now, but at least in my early years in the Congress, I was in the light. And I think I still am in some regards. I want to point out before I ask my question that we have Lord Monckton in the audience. Republicans had asked that he be allowed to testify today, and that wasn't possible. He did testify earlier, as Mr. Markey has pointed out, but we appreciate you coming over from London to at least observe the hearing. I was somewhat taken back, Mr. Vice President, by your listing of current environmental problems attributed to global warming. You did miss a few, though. the Dallas Cowboys have not won a playoff game in 10 years. You didn't mention that. And you also, as Mr. Markey pointed out to me, the New England Patriots didn't make it to the Super Bowl. I would add those to the list of problems that you enumerate. I do want to directly go to one of the problems that you talked about. You talked about CO2 concentrations rising in the oceans and the effect that that is or could be having. I have a book here called CO2 Global Warming in Coral Reefs by Dr. Craig Idso, who has a magazine that he publishes each month called CO2 Science. And I'm going to read the summary from the book, and I'll put it in the record. The rising CO2 content of the atmosphere may induce changes in ocean chemistry pH that could slightly reduce coral calcification rates, but potential positive effects of hydrospheric CO2 enrichment may more than compensate for this modest negative phenomenon. Theoretical predictions indicate that coral calcification rates should decline as a result of increasing CO2 concentrations by as much as 40% by the year 2100. However, real-world observations indicate that elevated CO2 and elevated temperatures are having just the opposite effect. In light of the above observations and in conjunction with all the material presented, it is clear that climate alarmist claims of impending marine species extinctions due to increases in both temperature and atmospheric CO2 concentration are not only not supported by real-world evidence, they are actually refuted by it. Now, I just put that into the record to point out that some of the phenomena that you indicate are obviously occurring. If they're occurring, they're occurring. But to lay that at the feet of global warming is not substantiated by the science. And some of these alarmist predictions are just that. They're predictions. They will not be fact. Now, let's get to some things that are fact. We know that the United States each year creates man-made CO2 emissions in the neighborhood of 7 billion metric tons, 7 billion. If you cost that man-made CO2 at $100 a ton, which most of the experts who've looked at the cap-and-trade system say that the tons cost is going to be between 100 and 200 billion, if you take the $100 a ton number, that's $700 billion a year. Now, my friend Mr. Markey and Mr. Waxman are engaging in some trading right now. They're trying to give free allowances to perhaps get votes. I won't say they're doing that, but it appears to me that they're doing that. So they're going to give some allowances away. Let's say they give 3.5 billion tons of allowances away. That still means that there's going to be 3.5 billions of tons that have to be costed. Let's say that we take the EPA estimate that it's only $20 a ton, not 100. I think it's going to be a lot more than 20, but we'll take the EPA number. That's still, if they give away half the allowances and they only cost $20 a ton, that number is $70 billion a year. How in the world can we have a cap-and-trade system that doesn't cost jobs and doesn't cost the economy, even if it is only half the tons at $20 a ton?
Congressman Barton, I want to address the point that you made about the science. I don't question your sincerity for one moment.
And I don't question yours, so we're equal on that.
Thank you. I believe that it's important to look at the sources of the science that we rely on. With all due respect, I believe that you have relied on people you have trusted who've given you bad information. I don't blame the investors who trusted Bernie Madoff, but he gave them bad information.
I've never talked to Bernie Madoff.
I'm not saying that you have. But he gave them bad information and committed a massive fraud that ended up hurting most of all the people who trusted him. Senator Warner made reference in his opening statement to the story on the front page of the New York Times this morning. Absolutely incredible. The largest corporate carbon polluters in America, 14 years ago, asked their own people to conduct a review of all this science. And their own people told them what the international scientific community is saying is correct. There is no legitimate basis for denying it. Then, these large polluters committed a massive fraud far larger than Bernie Madoff's fraud. They are the Bernie Madoffs of global warming. They ordered the censoring and removal of the scientific review that they themselves conducted. And like Bernie Madoff, they lied to the people who trusted them in order to make money. And the CEO of the largest, if I can just finish my response, Congressman.
Look, I will stipulate that CO2 concentrations are going up. There's no debate about that. They're about 380 parts per million, and they're going to rise to in the neighborhood of 500 parts per million in the next 50 to 100 years. I'll stipulate that. Now, the consequences of that, and whether that's because of man-made CO2, I think are debatable. And I don't know about this scientific peer review that you just talked about, but if somebody lied about something 14 years ago, I'm sure Mr. Waxman and Mr. Markey will conduct an investigation and oversight hearing into that. My question to you was about the cost of the allowance system. How are we going to pay for it, and how many jobs are we going to lose? Now, if you've got information about something that happened 14 years ago, I'm sure, again, our chairman and subcommittee chairman, Mr. Stupak, who's the oversight subcommittee chairman, we'll look at it. But answer my question about the cost, please.
It's on the front page of the New York Times today by Andrew Revkin. The leading corporate carbon polluters themselves conducted a review of this science and found that it's valid. And to the point you made a moment ago, they verified in their own studies that man-made global warming is raising temperatures and causing this crisis. Like Bernie Madoff, they lied about it in order to make money, and they themselves profited. The CEO of the largest got a one-time payment of $400 million. Now, again, those who have trusted them and believed them are due an apology. These corporations ought to apologize to the American people for conducting a massive fraud for the last 14 years.
My time's expired, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has expired. The Chair recognizes the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for recognizing me. You made me very happy today. I get to welcome back two very dear friends, great public servants, real patriots, men of distinction and ability, wonderful leaders. My old friend John Warner, who lived down the street from me and who has shown himself to be a man of extraordinary courtesy and decency in all of his activities. And my very special friend Albert Gore, whose father and my father and families were friends for many years, who served with distinction on this committee, and I want to say we had a lot of fun here working on the same questions in earlier days that we are today. And I want to say how proud I am to see him back and to thank him for being here with us today. Gentlemen, when I was at Kyoto, the Chinese, I asked them, I said, now, you're not going to be covered by this agreement. They said, no. They said, I said, when will you be covered? He said, well, we're developing countries and we're not going to ever be covered by it. And they indicated they really didn't intend to be covered by it. So now we've got ourselves in a situation where we're going to go forward, and I think we have to go forward. But the question is, how are we, if we go forward, are we going to see that we don't carry the burdens of the whole situation? Kyoto gave us a situation where the Eastern Europeans were out because they were former communists, never excluded. The Europeans all adroitly excluded themselves from coverage. The developing nations were excluded. And when I looked around the room to see who was going to be covered by this proposition, I found there's only one country, United States. Now, how do we see to it that these other countries do things that this doesn't, that we are going to do and that we agree have to be done, and that we're not the only country who is going to suffer the economic penalties of going forward on this, while these other folks ride on our back?
Congressman Dingell, thank you for your kind words.
I meant it.
Senator Warner, I know, and I appreciate it. Senator Warner mentioned your work, others did on the Clean Air Act. I want to also recall that you were the principal author of the National Environmental Policy Act. And in the same year that was passed, the original Clean Air Act was carried by Ed Muskie and our good friend Howard Baker, my fellow Tennessean. It passed 425 to 4 on the House floor, and because of the bipartisan leadership in the Senate, I believe it passed unanimously. And I think I just express the hope that we can find our way back to that kind of bipartisanship. Now, on your question, I believe that the provisions in this bill put in place a mechanism for dealing with any recalcitrant nation that does not go along. And I believe we have the legal authority under the WTO to do that. But before we ever get to that stage, I honestly believe that when the United States leads the way, we're going to see a big shift with a momentum toward a truly global agreement. We talked a little bit about India and China earlier. There was a story and a study last week showing, according to one scientist, 75% of all the ice and snow in the Himalayas could be gone in a decade, partly because of global warming and the black.
I want to make it clear. I don't quarrel with.
I know you. I know you don't, sir.
You and I know each other for a long time, and I am concerned that other folks are going to skin us. We're going to do the things, and they're going to drive the benefits, and we're going to spend the money, and we're going to lose the jobs. Now, how do we protect our people, and how do we see that we provide protection for the trade-exposed industries?
Right.
And I am not satisfied that this bill has an adequate protection for our workers and our industries in those areas, particularly given the attitudes of other countries which expect us to carry the load while they get a free ride.
Well, just to briefly finish the point, because it's in direct response to that question, I was citing that particular science study as an illustration of why I believe that China in particular is moving much closer to joining a global agreement. And I believe that if the United States leads, we will get a global agreement that avoids the problems that you're talking about. Were it not to unfold in that way, I believe that we would have the means to protect against the problems that you worry about rightly. And I believe that we should afford ourselves of that protection and take those and use those tools.
Now let me get to one more question because the time's running out. We have choice between we've got to finance this and we've got to enforce it. Cap and trade is one mechanism. Energy tax is another. Every economist says that a carbon tax is a better, more efficient, fairer way of doing it. The Europeans have had 2 fine, and maybe 3, fine failures in their application of cap and trade. How do we avoid the mistakes that they made, and how do we come up with something that gives us the best? Nobody in this country realizes that cap and trade is a tax, and it's a great big one. And so I want to get a bill that works. How do we choose the best course? Cap and trade, carbon tax. At times, my dear friend Albert, you have been an advocate of a carbon tax as the better way to go. How do we address this problem?
Well, I have for 20 years supported a CO2 tax that's given back to the people so that it's revenue neutral but accomplishes the desired effect. But I've never proposed it as a substitute for cap and trade. I am in favor of both. And a number of the countries around the world that have done the best job of addressing the climate crisis and strengthening their economies have, in fact, put both in place. But I believe that the cap and trade approach is the essential first step, partly because it is the only basis upon which we can envision a truly global agreement, because it's very difficult to imagine a harmonized global
tax. I
tax.
apologize, my dear friend, for interrupting you, but how do we avoid the mistakes that the Europeans made? They've screwed it up twice real good. How do we avoid those? How do we get a program that really carries out our responsibility and our trust to the American people?
I know Senator Warner wants to make a comment, but just briefly, I think by learning from the mistakes that they made, as they themselves have learned from their own mistakes.
I'm not saying
their initial allocation was off. They have gone back and made significant changes. I think that it is beginning to work very effectively there. And country by country, we are seeing the results there. So I think we can learn from what they have already learned.
Just a brief reply on the issue of China. You put your finger on the man on the street out here is asking us that very same question. And my response would be as follows. Because of our inability to reconcile differences as the last international round, the United States gave cover. They gave protection to China and India to stand back behind us and say, they're not going to go, we're not going to go. That's why I urge this committee, in its deliberations, you may not achieve all that you set out to do in this very courageous bill thus far, but as we say, get a beachhead on this issue in this Congress, because it's only going to get more complicated and tougher for successive Congresses. Lay the beachhead, and let's hope that we can build on that foundation and go forward in the coming years and achieve the totality of our goals.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Vice President, Senator. Since we don't have the allocation language yet, it hasn't been released, whether it's auction or allocation of free credits or carbon tax, do you think that Congress and the American business community and the American people would benefit from a complete and open hearing on this allocation language once it is released, whatever it might be? Should we have open, transparent hearings on this before we act?
Well, I support the leadership of the committee and its approach to gathering information, and that would be my answer.
Okay, Senator Warner.
Well, I would join my colleague on that point. I mean, I think transparency is more vital with this legislation than anything I've seen in recent times. Because
so we should have a hearing once we have the language?
I'm not presumptuous to come over here as a member of the former body and tell you how to go about your business.
All right.
I just strongly urge you to do something in this Congress. Now, the cap and trade is tough. It's a tough issue, but we don't want to appear that we're using cap and trade as a means to just tax those who can pay to distribute it all over.
Okay, thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, I did not hear your answer to Mr. Barton's question. What is the cost of this bill to every American family?
Well, the study that I think that is most authoritative, before taking into account the savings in their energy use that this bill will occasion, is around 30 cents a day. But again, let me emphasize that I think there will be actual reductions. And the reason is actually very simple. During the days of very cheap energy earlier in the century, we developed patterns that led to huge amounts of waste in energy that we all began to just kind of take for granted. And with the better engineering and the better science, the retrofitting and installation of more efficient ways of using energy really allow sharp reductions. In the state of California, which adopted some of the provisions that are similar to those in this bill, for the last 30 years, there has been a zero increase in energy use per capita, but while the economy has grown in California, GDP by 80% over the same period of time.
Okay, is that 30 cents per family per day or
I
per person?
I believe it's per household.
Per
yes.
household?
Yes.
And do you concur with that, Senator Warner?
About a postage stamp per day. But again, I think that much more than that will be saved by implementing the other provisions.
And can you supply us with the study or the reference to the study?
I believe it's the EPA study that was produced 3 days ago.
All right,
and I believe it's been presented to the committee.
Thank you. William Nordhaus, one of the most distinguished experts on the economics of climate change, has pointed out that the Kyoto Protocol would have imposed disproportionately large cost on the U.S., yet it would have had almost no effect on global temperatures. In large part, the lack of results stemmed from the refusal of China and India to adopt firm binding caps on their domestic emission. How do you explain the statements of China and India that they made at Bali, demanding that the developed world pay them for any greenhouse reduction costs that they incur? They have demanded that the developed world pay them for any greenhouse gas reductions that they make.
Well, the rhetoric between the developed and the developing countries has been in a rut for years and decades. The reality of the world today is that China's moved a long way. China's ready to move at Copenhagen. I think you've got a very different situation with China today.
So you do not feel that this principle of income transfers to the developing countries is valid?
I think that technology assistance and adaptation, I think adaptation to the impacts of climate change is particularly important, and I think if the way it's addressed in this bill is excellent.
I associate myself with the comments of my colleague here. We just dismiss that type of argument out of hand. I think world condemnation of China and India will come about shortly if there's some foundation in fact, and I believe it is, of the EPA finding that this is detrimental to health. Those two nations ought to be high on the areas where that health is going to be affected. And this may change their thinking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I hope you'll convey our thanks to Tipper Gore for her work on this cause as well. I've got two questions today. First, I want to ask about a position a relatively well-known individual has taken at one time about a cap-and-trade position. I just want to read a question and an answer, a quote from February 15, 2007. This former congressman was asked, in 2000, candidate George Bush pledged mandatory carbon caps. It was a campaign pledge. What did you think of it at the time? Were you for that? This former congressman answered, I think if you have mandatory carbon caps combined with a trading system, much like what we did with sulfur, and if you have a tax incentive program for investing in the solution, that there's a package there that's very, very good. And frankly, it's something I would strongly support, close quote. This action plan is essentially what we're doing in this bill of a carbon cap, a trading system, and incentives for the development of entrepreneurship. This former congressman went on to say the caps with the trading system on sulfur has worked brilliantly because it was brought free market attitudes, entrepreneurship, and technology and made it very profitable to have less sulfur. So people said, wow, it's worth my time and effort. Now that former congressman who said that on February 15, 2007 was former Congressman Newt Gingrich, who will shortly come into this room and testify that this bill is a combination of bubonic plague and Ebola virus for the U.S. economy. Is there any scientific reason of which you are aware that would make a carbon cap system of the type we have proposed productive economically in a wise move on February 15, 2007, and today unfathomably destructive?
I think I'll try to dance around that question.
You're entitled to, as a former vice president. You have that right. Well, we'll take that as a rhetorical question. And
well, see, I think that one of the great questions here, for those of us who believe in capitalism and the power of the marketplace, is why don't we use this great tool to solve the biggest crisis we're facing? CO2 is invisible, tasteless, and odorless. And more importantly, it is not registered on the accounting ledgers. It has no price associated with it. So the old aphorism, out of sight, out of mind, applies. As a consequence, we in this world today will put 70 million tons of it into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet. Scientists have known for 150 years that CO2 traps heat, and for 100 years have worried that a massive increase would trap so much heat that it would cause big changes. And for the last 25 years, we have had the preeminent scientific organization in the world, the 3,000 best scientists in the world from 113 countries, have issued 4 unanimous reports saying we've got to deal with it. So how are we going to deal with it? The best way to deal with it is to use the marketplace.
Mr. Vice President, I want to ask you about, in a local impact, how that would work. I was happening to talk to a guy who runs Taylor Shellfish. They have an oyster farm in Puget Sound, really reputable business for a long time. They can't grow oyster seed now in Puget Sound the last couple of years. And there is a very strong suspicion it is associated with the acidification of the ocean, which you educated us about. That, by the way, the NOAA research is that this is happening in the west coast of the United States probably twice as fast, which is now 30% worse than pre-industrial times. There's new research on this. He could lose his business as a result of a policy of inaction, which some are suggesting here, that we should not act. And many of us believe that the cost of inaction here are much greater than the cost of action, that we will reduce the cost of the U.S. economy by actually acting. And I've got a lot of businesses in my district, like right across the street, Sapphire Energy. They're doing algae-based biofuels, Infinia Energy doing Stirling engine solar. We think we can grow the economy and avoid the devastation a lot of these businesses, like the Taylor Oyster Farm, may have. Is that a fair projection of what the future could be?
Well, I think it is. And it's a challenge to the moral imagination to deal with the scope and scale of these changes. The idea that the entire world ocean would grow so acidic that everything that makes a shell will be unable to do so unless we take action is just astounding. And at the base of the food chain are these tiny little critters that have very thin shells. They're already being affected. If the base of the food chain is affected, then everything up the food chain is affected. The coral reefs are already under stress, great stress. A study just came out showing the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, the largest reef in the system in the world, thousands of miles, be functionally dead by 2050 without action. Now, it's a combination of the warming water temperatures and the acidification. But yes, no, I think you're right on target. We need to address this.
Thank you.
And thank you, Congressman Inslee, for your outstanding leadership and initiative on this issue over the years.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice President, Senator. It's good to have you before the committee. I wanted to just note that, Mr. Vice President, your reference of 30 cents a day comes from an EPA study, I believe. Unfortunately, that EPA study also assumes 150% growth in nuclear power in order to achieve that 30 cents a day, and that nuclear part is not in this bill. I know there's concern about worker retraining. Mr. Vice President, you said you wanted every coal worker who lost his job to get a job. Unfortunately, the worker transition piece in this bill, all we have is in parentheses, to be supplied, page 568 of the bill. And I've asked every other witness this. Have you each read the bill in its entirety? Can I get a yes or no?
Congressman, I have read all 648 pages of this bill. It took me 2 transcontinental flights on United Airlines.
I get on another one at 2 o'clock. Senator Warner, have you read the bill?
The answer is no, I have not.
All right. Let's go on to a couple of points because, Mr. Vice President, because you talked about an issue that's dear to my heart, and I've raised it at every hearing I've participated in, and that is the health of our America's forests. I come from a district with 11 national forests in it, with 20% unemployment in some of these counties because nothing's happening meaningful in these forests. I'm a big advocate of biomass. Do you support, yes or no, because I was tight on time, biomass from federal forests as a renewable energy source?
I think the protection of the federal forest is important. And Congressman, as a matter of curiosity, are you seeing the tree death in your forest from the beetles and the drying?
In fact, this is from 1989, Tanner Gulch Fire. It wiped out spring Chinook salmon run in Oregon's upper Grand Ronde River. This is an overchoked forest, although it looks fairly healthy from this picture, in California, federal forest. Here's what happens after you treat it and get it in. Here's what happens when you treat it and try and manage it for old growth. Where's the net? No, I don't want that one. This is the Malheur National Forest. It's out in Harney County. They have 20% unemployment right now. This is what happens when you don't treat it and it burns.
When you say treat it,
get in and manage it the way the biologists believe it should be managed. We have a 79-year backlog at the rate we're treating right now to get these forests into balance to deal with the climate change that you outlined. And the Forest Service, as you know, has done terrific research work over the years trying to figure out climate change and what needs to be done as management in these forests. That Malheur National Forest I referenced, they're at least 25 years out based on the limited amount of acreage. We had investors who were ready to go into that county with 20% unemployment and do woody biomass production of renewable energy, and they cannot even get certainty from the forest to supply. This legislation on page 8 says woody biomass is not renewable if it comes off federal ground, period. Beyond that, the way it's written, I've had private land foresters tell me even off their private land it would shut down biomass facilities if you followed this. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying.
Do you agree with shutting it down? Do you agree with this language?
I don't have a lot of confidence based on what has happened in the past when something, I think that if you and I could sit down and talk about every little detail of which tree and so forth, in Canada they have this kind of management approach, and yet their forests are being devastated.
And why is that?
It's primarily because the warmer temperatures are allowing.
So doesn't that
if I could finish my, you asked me a question. If I couldn't finish my answer, it's primarily, according to them, because the warmer temperatures due to man-made global warming are causing the pine beetles and bark beetles to go on the rampage, and they have lost many billions of dollars of trees. And when they die and get dry and the higher temperatures, they're vulnerable to fire, and we've had all-time record forest fires.
So doesn't that speak to managing those forests, to thin them out when you know you're going to have drought, to open up the stands, get them back in balance with nature, and to be able to use the thing I'm fighting here is when you take that material out to do exactly what Canada's doing, to do exactly what needs to happen on the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, we have more than 200,000 acres of federal forest land that's exactly that way, bug-infested lodgepole pine. When that material comes out, why in the devil do we say it's not renewable and can't be turned into pucks like this to help reduce carbon from coal This could be put in a coal plant in my district if they could get enough of this made. This comes out of Canada, by the way. They're doing that. Why do we preclude it in this bill?
Well, I think the record of what's happened when it's been opened up in the past has given a lot of people pause and diminished their confidence that it could be managed in a way that resembles the right result.
Now, as you know, Mr. Vice President, every forest has a management plan, and every activity on that forest requires full NEPA. Mr. Chairman.
I'm just tapping you to I'm not gaveling you, I'm just tapping, let you know you're passed.
Because a lot of these answers have gone on for 12 minutes after the 5. I guess the point here is every activity on a federal forest already is covered by NEPA, isn't it? Every management activity.
I don't think those provisions of NEPA have been effective in preventing some of the abuses that occurred during some times in the past.
I'll tell you this. I'll close. Why don't you come out and I'll take you to the Malheur National Forest, and together we'll walk in these stands, or the Fremont-Wainema National Forest, and we'll meet with the professionals. Or up in the Wallowa-Whitman, where they're heating the school with biomass, or the Harney County. Apparently, I'm out of time.
I appreciate your invitation, Congressman. I have been to the forests of Oregon. I would love to come back. I was active in forming the forest plan of 1994 for the Pacific.
The Northwest Forest Plan, which has its own set of issues being implemented.
Yeah, but it's been largely a great success.
I dispute that.
Well,
gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me also thank both of you for your testimony today and for your extraordinary service to our country. Let me try to go in a little different direction if I can, and this time goes very quickly, as you can imagine. But I represent a very low-income district in eastern North Carolina. Greenville, Rocky Mount, Elizabeth City, very low-income district. We're the 4th from the bottom in the United States of America in terms of median family income. I think the income is like $30,400 per year, and so we are essentially a poor district. And so I'm obviously concerned about the cost of this legislation and what it will do to low-income families, not just for electricity, but for everything that we consume, plastics and rubber and food and the like. And so my question to you is Mr. Gore, what do I tell a single parent, for example, in my district with 2 young children making $8 an hour? What can I say to reassure her that she will be able to afford the cost of this legislation? And it may be 30 cents a day. It may end up being much more than that. I hope that you're right and that those on the other side of the aisle are wrong. But if it happens to be expensive, my low-income families, cannot absorb the cost of this legislation. I need some help with that.
Yeah, well, I think other provisions of this bill can lead to reductions in the cost for that family. And as we saw in Hurricane...
But not immediate reductions.
Well, it depends on how quickly they're implemented and how they're taken advantage of. And let me say that, as we saw with Hurricane Katrina, low-income families are often the most likely to suffer the harmful consequences if we do not address the global warming issue. And the new job creation that comes from the green energy jobs that are being created are going to benefit the same communities of low-income families.
Well, that's very difficult to explain to a low-income family that's already in the deficit, in deficit spending. It's very difficult, and we need to do a better job in crafting this legislation to make sure that we have an economic offset, some type of assistance for low-income families, to make sure that they do not pay an inordinate price for this legislation. Senator Warner, as you can see from the ebb and flow of the testimony today, there are some who criticize this legislation as a measure that will result in fewer American jobs and fewer investment opportunities. You talked a few minutes ago about creating a beachhead. I know what that means in military language, but how can we develop a political beachhead to make sure that the American people understand this and to make sure that the element of fear does not dominate this conversation?
I shared the burdens you have of talking to my people when I was leading the effort in the Senate. It was a brand new concept then, and we couldn't establish clear cost parameters. But I would say to that wonderful family, the cost today, hopefully, will result in an America that they pass on to their children, that they can enjoy as did their parents. I do believe, and I say this respectfully, Mr. Chairman, and when we worked on our bill, I tried to resist a lot of the efforts, good intention, to take such funds that were going to be developed by the cap and trade concept and spread them around in areas other than directly for the goals of increasing our energy, clean energy output. I think if you begin to try and utilize this bill as another means by which to take care of well-deserving families and well-deserving causes, you're going to lose public support. They'll pay if they're confident that the dollars in this bill go towards the goal of clean energy, cost-effective energy, and improved health.
So you would not support the concept of offsetting the economic impact on low-income families?
Well, there may be other ways to do it than this piece of legislation. If we make this I would say, when I talk to my colleagues, a welfare bill, I don't think the public are going to begin to support it.
On the question of the loss of jobs, the legal
loss of jobs.
Does taking action on this legislation come at the expense of American jobs?
No, I think quite the contrary. There are authoritative polling that shows that the American public look at this bill as a means to increase the number of jobs, as well as help improve health conditions, and they're quite anxious to see that it will help our national security.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
I thank the chairman. I appreciate both witnesses being with us today. I appreciate your willingness to hear from members of the subcommittee. Vice President Gore, when you were here at our subcommittee, maybe it's been 2 years ago, as you were leaving, I recall the statement was made that about a carbon tax that would just replace the existing payroll tax and income tax. And there is certainly Tom Friedman, writing in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, asked the very same question. Would we not be better, rather than trying to play hide the ball with cap and trade, would we not be better just being honest with the American people to say we're going to tax energy, we're going to tax carbon, and perhaps to the extent that we tried to make that revenue neutral by replacing the payroll tax, replacing at least a portion of the income tax with this new carbon tax, would that not be a more straightforward way for us to go about this rather than us try to pick winners and losers?
Well, as I said earlier, Congressman, thank you for your question. As I said earlier, I've supported a revenue-neutral CO2 tax with the money given back. It could be given back to the people in a variety of different ways. But I do not support it to the exclusion of cap and trade. I think that cap and trade is the essential first step in order to use the market forces to address this problem and to secure a global agreement around that principle, which already has broad support throughout the world.
And I actually would dispute that concept, but here's part of our problem. I absolutely agree with both of you about the economic factors. There's no question that the energy cost of energy, the burden of energy costs on our families has been significant. It will be significant again in the future. So finding ways to deliver energy at a reasonable cost is important, and no argument with that. No argument about the security question. Our good friend Boone Pickens said it so eloquently last summer that we're funding both sides of the war on terror. People get that. Our trade deficit that has been so high recently, people get the negative impact that has on our economy. And I think one of you even referenced peak oil to some degree. At some point, oil likely is going to be a finite resource and looking for other sources. Absolute agreement to that point. But we always then come down to arguing about the did global warming cause Katrina? Did global warming cause the death of a polar bear? And there are going to be arguments on both sides. Why not just leave that aside? Why not focus on the security? Why not focus on the economy? Why do we have to be in a position of picking winners and losers? We've just watched a financial meltdown in this country, the likes of which hasn't been seen in some time. Now, if people like credit default swaps, they're really going to like the carbon swaps that are going to occur and the carbon future swaps. We spent a full day in this committee last summer talking about the manipulation of the energy futures market in oil. We're going to create, I fear, another such system that people who have an inclination to react dishonestly to systems are going to actually have a new opportunity. Is that not a problem?
Well, let me look at your analogy in a slightly different way. There were warnings that the credit default swaps and the subprime mortgages and the other activities that caused the financial crisis were going to bring us ruin if we didn't address them, and nothing was done about it. If I could finish my answer. There are warnings now of a far worse catastrophe, and they're coming from a unified IPCC representing the global scientific community, and if nothing were to be done about it, the results would be far worse. Now, let's look at the subprime mortgages. I remember the days when you made a down payment and proved you could make the monthly payments. And we were told the risk was washed away by securitizing them and lumping them together, and that assumption collapsed. We now have several $1 trillion of subprime carbon assets whose value is based on an assumption that it's perfectly okay to put 70 million tons of that pollution up there every 24 hours. So the reason, in answering your first question, is why can't we ignore it? Because it's the biggest crisis we've ever faced.
And no one who's come before this committee from a scientific basis can show us the smoking gun that mankind is causing this to happen. You can create relationships between the number of sunspots and the partisan makeup of the Senate. Anything can be proven if you're willing to take the time to have the numbers. Let me just go to another point, because it was a terribly important...
Could I respond to that?
No, I need to make this point. Dr. Apt, who was with us yesterday, and he said it so eloquently that we have to focus on reducing carbon dioxide rather than trying to pick winners and losers in this. If we will focus on what is the reasonable thing to do, whether we want to focus on security, whether we want to focus on the economy, or we can spend a lot more time arguing about the science of climate change. When we construct this bill, and Senator Warner said it so well, when we construct this bill, we have to have the flexibility that we give people credit for doing the energy efficiency things that we want them to do. We give people credit for creating the newer technologies that we want them to do, rather than us pick every jot and tittle of winners and losers in the bill, which is unfortunately the draft that we have in front of us. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Vice President?
Could I have just a minute, less than a minute? I think a carbon tax is very simple, very understandable, but I think it would bring the bill down. I don't think you get the votes to support it. The inherent advantage...
And just for the record, I would not support a carbon tax.
The inherent... I think inherently in a cap-and-trade system that can be devised is the incentive for the industrial base in this country, the technological base, to solve the problems and to go forward. It also, if we have a bill, it begins to enable that same base to do its long-range planning. The power industry has to look forward 10, 12, 15 years out as to their requirements. And if we keep hanging over this global warming thing over their head, they can't make their orderly planning. We've got to get the beachhead. We've got to tell them, here's what we're trying to do, and can you do it if we give you this flexibility and this support? And they did it in clean air. They can do it in this.
And I would just make a point. This bill does not have the flexibility inherent in the language as it's before us today.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask the committee with unanimous consent that I be allowed to submit comments for the record on behalf of the National Association of Realtors.
Without objection, so included.
Thank you. Mr. Gore, I have to, Vice President Gore, I have to just admire how you've been willing to put your personal reputation on the line year after year for something you truly believe in, despite the most vicious attacks on your character that are totally without merit. And that takes a great amount of bravery, and I have a greatest amount of respect for you for doing that.
Thank you, sir.
Well, you've been pretty explicit about the economic roller coaster that we've been on due to energy instability, the price instability of energies. Do you believe that I believe, that by increasing energy efficiency and finding new sources of energy, that we can get ahead of the energy cost problem and ultimately pay less for energy for better results with the cap-and-trade system, which will also create jobs and stabilize the economy and get rid of that roller coaster?
I certainly do agree with that. I think that if we made up our minds to lead this transition, we would benefit not only with millions of new jobs, but also with lower energy costs and a much more productive economy. I don't think there's any question about it. The only question is whether we're going to lead the world or whether we're going to follow those who provide leadership elsewhere. If we lead, we get the jobs. We get the technologies to sell elsewhere. And we get the productivity gains. That's the role I think we ought to adopt.
Thank you, Vice President. Senator, did you want to respond to that? Thank you. Mr. Gore, you mentioned the smart grid as a part of the solution to reducing our carbon emissions. Can you explain the connection there? I think it's something that a lot of people don't quite understand.
Yeah. The phrase smart grid is confusing to some because in many parts of the world it's used to describe the distribution of energy and the use of smart meters that give homeowners and business owners a better way to reduce the wasteful use of energy and use efficiency and conservation more effectively. But maybe we ought to call it the super grid. That's what the Europeans call one of their proposals, because it essentially has two components. It makes it possible to transmit over high technology lines over a long distance renewable electricity from the areas with high sunlight in the desert, for example, to the cities where it's used. And from the wind corridor that my friend Boone Pickens talks about a lot, running up north and south along the high plains and the mountain states, and take that electricity to the cities where it's used, and from the geothermal areas. That's the first part, long-distance, low-loss transmission from areas that don't have a lot of people but do have a lot of renewable resources to the places where it can be used. The second feature of it involves the use of data processing, chips, very cheap but very powerful and effective information technologies to empower the end users to use less and get more, and to sell electricity back into the grid if they put photovoltaic cells on their roof or use small wind or other forms of what's called distributed power generation.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. That was a fairly detailed discussion. Do you have any comments about the value of using a green bank in terms of making the transition easier for the American economy or for the individuals and families in our country?
Well, that's not in the draft of this legislation, and I want to reiterate and make it clear that I support this legislation. But I am familiar with the proposal that my friend of 50 years, Reed Hunt, has put together with others called a green bank. I think it's a very imaginative, very excellent idea, and I commend it to your attention.
Well, thank you. You know, your list of impacts due to global warming was fairly sobering, and if we're marching along that path, it's fairly risky. Do you think that that's? Do you think we're sort of on a steady state, or do you think we're accelerating our march down that path?
Well, we're presently accelerating in a direction toward a precipice. We still have time to change course. And I'll answer in a way that's also relevant to the answer. Time ran out on the exchange that I was having with Congressman Burgess.
Feel free to end to respond to that earlier question.
Not too long from now, the next generation is going to look back at the beginning years of this century and ask one of two questions. Either they'll ask, What were you thinking? Didn't you hear the scientists? Why did you prefer to listen to some outlier quack that got money from these carbon polluters that were engaged in a massive fraud? Why didn't you listen to the global scientific community? Just because you didn't have access to the scientific studies of the carbon polluters themselves because they hit them is no excuse. What were you thinking? Why did you let this happen? Or they'll ask a second question, the one I want them to ask. How did you find the moral courage to look past the short-term controversies of the day and rise to solve a crisis that so many said was inconvenient to address? Thank you. Senator Warner's generation won a war in the Pacific and in Europe simultaneously, and then put down the Marshall Plan and the United Nations and the post-war recovery. It wasn't very convenient for them to do, but they did it because our national security was at stake. Our national security is at stake now, and it is a challenge that this Congress must rise to. I don't know how to I don't know how to say it. I wish I could find the words to get past the partisan divide that both sides have contributed to. But I really wish I could find the words that would unlock this. It shouldn't be partisan. It should be something we do together in our national interest. The next generations are calling out to us.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we debate what I agree is a very important piece of legislation, in my opinion, and many others would have very detrimental effects on our economy if it was implemented the way it's been drafted. We've been trying to get a quantifiable grasp on the cost of this bill, how much it would actually cost American families, how many jobs would be created and lost. And number one, on the science side, we've had very divergent views. We've had dozens of experts come over the last few days and testify, giving very different opinions on the science. On the economics of it, we have not had the same kind of divergence. In fact, most economists and experts that have testified on the cost acknowledge, in fact, I'll refer to President Obama's own budget that was just passed 2 weeks ago. If you go to page 119 of the President's budget, he's anticipating generating $646 billion in new tax revenue from this bill. So clearly the President expects this bill to generate $646 billion in new taxes that even his own budget director has said would be passed on to consumers. Senator Warner, we had seen numbers on the Lieberman-Warner bill. The President's budget director today, he was the head of CBO last year when he testified on your bill. He said it would have cost consumers about $1,300 a year more in their average utility bills, in addition to everything else they buy that's related to electricity, gasoline, food, anything else. Can you, and then Senator Gore, talk to the numbers that the Congressional Budget Office and now the President's Budget Director gave to your bill and how that would relate to this bill in terms of the cost to American families of implementing a cap-and-trade energy tax?
I would say that the work done by the Budget Office on the bill that I was privileged to be working with is a good foundation, and that you can, I think many of the assumptions would carry over to this legislation. But, Congressman, we've got to make a start. If we're looking for absolute certainty, we're never going to get a bill. We have to start the learning curve, start the process, and then build on it. And that's why I strongly urge that you incorporate language to give to the Chief Executive Officer of this country the authority to move in when he believes that corrections have to be.
And of course, we don't see that in this, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know my time's limited. Vice President Gore.
Congressman, you began by denying that there is a consensus on the science. there is a consensus on the science.
Well, you mustn't have been listening to our testimony that we've had for the last few days with dozens of experts that have come in who have given completely different views.
Well,
I would encourage you to go back and look at the testimony this committee's heard.
There are people who still believe that the moon landing was staged on a movie lot in Arizona.
And neither of us are one of those, and I know you like giving those cute anecdotes. This is not a cutesy issue. We're talking about something that can export millions of jobs out of our economy, out of our country, and testimony's been given just to those numbers. And so we're talking about a serious consequence that there would be on this country and the carbon leakage that would occur where the carbon would be emitted, but it would be emitted in China and India, and the jobs would go to China and India. And that's been testified before this committee in the last few days as well. So would you testify about the actual cost? Do you want to talk about the cost?
Man-made global warming pollution causes global warming. That's not a cutesy issue. It's not an open issue.
It's your opinion. Obviously, you've stated it many times.
Would
you talk to the cost?
Opinion of the global scientific community, and more importantly,
and not in unanimity. There are others on the other side.
More importantly, Congressman, that opinion is the opinion of the scientific studies conducted by the largest corporate carbon polluters 14 years ago, who have lied to you and who have lied to the American people for 14 years.
And you talk about carbon, and I'm running out of time. We talk about carbon polluters. You talk about them. It's my understanding that back in 1997, when you were vice president, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, was involved in discussions with you at the White House about helping develop this type of policy, this trading scheme. And is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? It's been reported.
I don't know, but I met with Ken Lay, as lots of people did, before anybody knew that he was a crook.
Right, and clearly you can see why so many of us are concerned about this type of cap-and-trade energy tax that would be literally turning over this country's energy economy.
I didn't know him well enough to call him Kenny Boy.
Well, but you knew him well enough to help devise this trading scheme, and obviously we know what Enron and these big guys on Wall Street like Goldman Sachs, and I know you've got interest with Goldman Sachs.
No.
These people, well, that's been reported. Is that not accurate?
No, I wish I did.
With executives from you're partnered in companies with executives from Goldman Sachs. Well, if you're not. Either way, Enron clearly had an interest in doing this when they were around. We saw what they did. And when you see the types of people involved in wanting to set up this kind of scheme, you can see why so many of us are concerned about turning our energy economy over to a scheme that was devised by companies like Enron and some of these Wall Street firms that have wrecked our financial economy.
I don't really know if you want me to respond to that. I guess what you're trying to say, you're trying to...
I mean, clearly there will be big winners and big losers.
You're trying to say there's some kind of guilt by association? Is that
not association? I'm saying that there are going to be big winners and big losers in this bill, and that's been discussed by everybody talking. Big winners and big losers. But some of the big winners are some of the very financial experts that help destroy our financial marketplace. And I think that should be noted that companies like Enron helped come up with this trading scheme that would be invoked in cap and trade.
Enron didn't create this proposal in any way, shape, or form.
Well, the details are not in this bill.
False accusation.
The details are not in this bill, and I would suggest that they are.
Mr. Chairman, I do need a few minutes. I really have had a marvelous opportunity to work with many, many interested parties across this country on this subject, including corporate America and the business community. And I hope that those following this hearing don't get the views that the wrongdoing by what I hope is a very small minority should not be brushed across the whole spectrum. Indeed, if we're going to solve this problem, we have got to rely on the corporate America, the financial America, the technical America to work our way out within the constraints and directions of the legislation. But I find that there's far in the majority, most people are trying to responsibly come up with solutions to this problem.
And then there's an alternative. The American Energy Act, which was filed last year, which I still think is a better alternative to cap and trade, is still out there.
Gentleman's time has expired, and for the record,
I yield back.
For the record, the proposal that we're considering has had the CEO of General Electric, of Alcoa, of Rio Tinto, of corporations across the country who have testified in conjunction with major environmental groups. That is the proposal that we are considering. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm a new member of this committee, and as I've listened to the questions of my colleagues on both sides, I've come to the conclusion that there are those of us who I think basically take the view that you have advocated, that we have to act. And then some of the opposition comes from folks who don't believe it's necessary. They essentially deny the existence of the problem. But there are many good faith questions about what the impact will be on jobs, the dislocation, the economy. People like Mr. Burgess, Mr. Walden have asked questions that, frankly, I think those of us who are advocates have the burden of doing our best to answer. But at times it sometimes seems as though those concerns become not so much addressed to solve the problem, but to avoid action. And, Senator, I'm going to ask you, based on your 30 years of service in the United States Senate, having to find common ground with people on the other side of the aisle, what advice do you have to those of us who share your view that this is a bill that has to be passed? How do we find a way to reach agreement with the good faith objections that come from people who don't agree with us quite yet?
Well, that's been the history of our Congress since its very inception. We are admired by the world for many reasons, and one is that we have the longest continuously surviving form of government, and it provides for healthy debate. It provides, to the extent possible, for full debate. Unfortunately, our chamber, the Senate, now has had less and less debate because of resorting to certain rules which are on the book, created by ourselves. But it's important that the views of those in opposition be heard, respected, because I think most people are conscientious who object to this. But we've got to find a way. You cannot just accept and throw up your hands. We can't do it. We just must do it. Maybe you're not going to, and I hope you get as much as you think you can, but you're not going to get the whole loaf. You're going to get a part of it. But you will have sent the signal across America that the Congress is ready to move forward on this issue. And that'll get the attention here at home, and that'll get the attention of the world.
Thank you. Mr. Gore, I want to ask you your thoughts on a couple of approaches that I think make sense to take in order to try to build some of these bridges. One is efficiency. You've talked about that. My view, and I have some aspects in this bill that say we start addressing this by efficiency. It's within our control. We've got a provision in the bill, small one but important one, to allow homeowners to get tax credits, businesses to get tax credits and incentives for saving. The more they save, the more of an incentive they get. It's the local jobs that you spoke about. I would hope that that would be a way of finding some common ground. And a second issue may be to incorporate into this legislation a monitoring device to basically ask these questions every 3 months or 6 months about what is, in fact, the job impact, because those are fair questions. And I want to get your advice and thoughts about suggestions you might have to try to provide some legitimate reassurance to legitimate questions that are raised about dislocation and economic impact.
Yeah. Well, I think the provisions of the bill in the current draft adequately and imaginatively address that question. I think there would be potentially massive job losses if we did not adopt this legislation. Because if we just continue on with business as usual, ignoring the warnings, and then just sit and wait until the oil prices go sky high again, that's what would cause the massive job losses. I think that the creation of jobs by this bill will far, far outstrip any losses that would be associated with it. I genuinely believe that.
Okay. And what do you think about having in the bill some provision to actually try to monitor that, some referee that is actually looking at the data? What's the impact of each provision of the bill in providing, as we go along, some data that hopefully is credible?
Well, that sounds like a good idea to me. I know that there are provisions in the legislation now that require regular reports and regular analyses of several matters, some of which do relate to this. If they need to be fine-tuned, then maybe that's a good thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Senator?
While I haven't read the whole bill, I have studied those portions I felt that would be addressed today, and particularly the area of national security. So I think you should monitor it in order to give the President the guidelines as to move forward with the throttle or pull back on the throttle.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back, but I just want to tell the Vice President that my office in 1404 Longworth, I believe, was your dad's. That's what they're saying when he was in Congress.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. That's
I'm living in an apartment that you may be familiar with it's the Tennessee apartment in the Methodist South with Congressman Cooper.
Oh, great.
And I don't know if you left anything behind, but we'll check.
Not that I know of, but thank you.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Vice President, Senator Warner. It is an honor to have you here, and we appreciate your knowledge and insights on this issue. Our nation's security, our planet's sustainability, and our children's future really do hang in the balance at this moment. And the world is watching our every step. They are looking to us with the largest economy, the greatest innovations, the richest resources to bring leadership and commitment to this issue and to Copenhagen and beyond. I believe we absolutely cannot show up to Copenhagen empty-handed. Mr. Vice President, I know you've met with leaders from all over the globe on this issue and many others. And so I would like you to speak, and perhaps a little bit of a crystal ball looking into the future. How would the world respond to our bringing the policies in this bill to the table in Copenhagen, and how would the world react if we fail to act and we don't have those policies to bring to the negotiating table in Copenhagen?
I think the enactment of this legislation and the adoption of a position by the Obama administration that was in keeping with this legislation would be met with great relief and approval, although I must tell you that the reductions in this legislation and those proposed by the Obama administration are far short of what would cause cheering and celebration in the rest of the world, because so many other parts of the world have already gone much farther. But I think that it would be met with a sigh of relief. I think there would be, I think it would lead to a major shift by countries around the world, and would lead to an agreement that would put in place a mechanism for solving the climate crisis. Were this legislation not to pass, and if the administration went to this global negotiation without this legislation, then I think we might well see a slow-motion collapse of the negotiation, much as the Doha round has all but collapsed. And I think that would be awful to contemplate. I have no idea how the world could regroup and come up with some other approach without wasting decades. And of course, as many of you are well aware, some of the leading scientists in the world have said for some time now that we may be within a decade or so of crossing a tipping point beyond which this could unravel on us. I mentioned in my opening statement that the disappearance of the ice in the Arctic is already leading to methane releases from the thawing tundra. If that were to accelerate, it would be one of several tipping points that we really ought to avoid crossing.
Well, I have fairly recent recollections of the December 2007 round in Bali, where one negotiator, I think it was from Papua New Guinea, was famously quoted as saying to the U.S., "We look to your leadership, we yearn for your leadership, but if you're not going to lead, please get out of the way." And I do not want to see any sort of repeat of that type of thing on the world stage. You know, I want to relate to your struggle a few moments ago to come up with the right words to define this moment, because we're all talking and asking questions based on the concerns that our current constituents raise with us about this measure. And I wonder what if the future generations had a voice, and if people living in our districts in 2080 or 2090 could speak to us now, what would they be saying? And I think we would be acting fairly hastily if indeed we could hear their voices as we hear our constituents today. I'll give you one piece of poetry, actually, that I think brings it up pretty well, by a fellow named Drew Dellinger. He says, "It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in my dreams, what did you do when the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling?" And with that, I want to ask Senator Warner
if you could ask one quick question.
I had heard an anecdote, and I wanted to hear from you if it was true, that you came to your position on climate change and your leadership role at the urging of your grandchildren. Is that correct?
Yes, that's quite true in many ways. But I also, the gentleman that came from forest country, I went out in 1943, of course that was before you were born, and worked in the forest as a firefighter and a trailblazer. And those were pristine forests. A couple of years ago, I was out there in the same region. I asked the Forest Service to take me in. I didn't know where I was. I couldn't recognize anything. We drank out of the streams. We swam in the streams. We enjoyed the pristine forest. It's gone. So my children and grandchildren hold me accountable. Indeed, my own personal experiences were a factor. But it came always back to national security, as I'm urging this committee to incorporate.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and all questions from the subcommittee members has now expired.